So I'm going to, and then I have to do the sharing fun. And I can't do it till we're already in. So I just have to
Do your thing.
do the thing. All right, Jesus 101, episode 5, teachings and actions. And we are ready to go live. And hopefully that's going to do its thing. Oh, wait, I have to check something.
Do what you need
Sorry.
to do.
Yeah, I think I have shared it on my personal Facebook page instead of the church page. I did. All right, so I got to undo that.
No worries. I've never gone live on Zoom before. I don't even know how to do this.
Well, let's stop the live stream. Inevitably, you have to click like 7 things. So, oh,
Hmm.
good, we have some guests coming in. Welcome, Holtz. We are futzing through going live, and then we're going to do some introductions and talk about what we're going to talk about. All right, we click the correct buttons this time. Selecting page, going on First Pres Beach Street. Here we go. All right, we've got it this time. So we're here. We've figured out the technology. We've figured out how to live stream. We've figured out how to record, and we are getting ready to talk about Jesus again. So here with me, I have Reverend Macon. Macon, I called you your husband's name, Reverend Amy Armistead, which is double funny because Amy, when you first logged in, your name actually said Macon.
I know. We share a Zoom. Why pay for two?
Would you give yourself just a quick introduction, where you are, who you are?
Absolutely. I am Amy Armistead. I am a United Methodist pastor in Daytona Beach. I pastor the Gathering Place, which is a church plant. I used to say that we're new, but we're not so new anymore. In September, we're going on 4 years. Um, and so we're a church plant out of First United Methodist Ormond Beach, and we meet at the Foundry, which is a super cool co-working space in the LPGA area of Daytona.
Awesome. Well, I'm so grateful that you're here to start this conversation with me. And just to fill you in, and anybody that might be tuning in as their first episode, this is actually our fifth episode of Jesus 101. So we talked a little bit about an introduction, why it's even important to sort of talk about and understand who Jesus is in light of the world today, in light of some of the prevailing narratives of Christianity that are probably loudest, I would say, in our culture. So we talked a little bit about that. We talked a little bit about some of the parables of Jesus and how we interpret those, how we hold those, understand those. We talked about in the beginning, so we talked about Jesus's birth narrative, popular mythology, and the trappings of how we understand both that story from Mary and Joseph and angels and that piece, but also from John, where it talks about in the Word was with God, and how do we understand these things put together about how Jesus and the Logos and all of that. We've covered a lot of ground, Amy. And
Like it.
yeah, and then last we talked about Jesus's miracles and how we understood Jesus's miracles, what they mean, and how we apply them today. So now we're moving on. This week, episode 5 is teachings and actions of Jesus. So, what we'll focus most on is kind of the Sermon on the Mount. It's widely considered Jesus's largest teaching. It's recorded in multiple Gospels, either the Sermon on the Mount, the Sermon on the Plain, and gives us some real clues about who Jesus is and what's most important to him. But I'm also including in this topic not just the teachings, but also the actions, because there's sort of some themes around how teachings and actions overlap for Jesus. And I think sometimes as church folk, we are drawn into more one than the other. You know, we want to talk
Mhm.
about Jesus, we want to learn about Jesus. If you're like me, you grew up coloring sheets of Jesus, and doing little crosswords about Jesus and his disciples and these kind of things. But there wasn't as much emphasis on how do we live our day-to-day lives in ways that Jesus talked about and actually exampled for us.
Mhm.
So that's just a little ground to cover in slightly less than an hour. I think it's going to be fine.
Yeah, it's just one whole lifetime. It was only 33 years, but his ministry was only 3 years, so there you go.
3 years in a little less than an hour, no problem. Starting with the Sermon on the Mount, there's a number of key themes that stand out to me, and I want to pitch some of those, see your thoughts, and then hear what maybe stands out to you, Amy, from
Mhm.
Sermon on the Mount. Because again, that is sort of his quintessential teaching of his theology and his understanding of God and humanity. One of the big ones that sticks out to me that I think is really super challenging for Christian folk broadly is this idea of not judging other people.
Ugh,
Yeah.
isn't that the most annoying part of being a Christian? Like that we need to do that? It's very annoying because like I think my brain is like hardwired that way and Jesus says don't.
Yeah, well, and I think that's one of the things, speaking of hardwired, it's how do I know I'm good if I'm not judging? How do I know if I'm good if I'm not measuring up against other people, places, and things?
Hmm.
But again, Jesus over and over kind of says not to do that. So, one example that stands out to me is when Jesus invites us to consider the plank in our own eye
Hmm.
before the speck in our brothers and our neighbors' eye. And in that teaching, I mean, it's pretty clear that Jesus is saying, sort of, our modern day version might be, if you're pointing the finger at somebody, there's three fingers pointed back at you.
Hmm. Hmm.
And this idea of kind of taking stock of ourselves
Hmm.
instead of, you know, doing the work of standing around and judging everybody else and remaining in kind of this untouchable, self-righteous position. Um,
Yeah.
how does that hit you?
Yeah, totally. I just opened up my Bible to the Sermon on the Mount, and literally right there it is, and you could find it in Matthew 7. Do not judge so that you may not be judged. For with the judgment you make, you will be judged, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. And the Gathering Place has been in a sermon series on the Lord's Prayer, which is included in the Sermon of the Mount. And I had never we did the line, we went line by line, and it is forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And I never really like I want God to forgive me a whole lot. But if I forgive others to the extent by which I am willing to offer forgiveness or by the extent I am to judge others, like if God's gonna go by my playbook and by my standards, then like oh my gosh, I'm gonna cut off the forgiveness and the grace that I so want for myself and that I believe I'm deserving of. And I luckily grew up in a denomination where I heard a lot about grace. Um and I think it was a big pill for me to swallow in thinking about, am I extending the same amount of grace that I would expect God to give me?
Hmm.
And when the answer is no, oh my gosh, that was kind of a gut punch in the stomach. Am I willing to forgive? Am I willing to pass judgment by which I hope that God is returning to me?
And I love that you brought that out because I think over and over again, Jesus calls us to a different standard than the world standard. You know,
Hmm.
I think we walk around, and especially as young children, though, it's a hard habit to shake, wanting things to be fair. We
Oh,
think that
yes.
fair is the ultimate standard, right? If I have four things and you have no things, I give you two, and then they are fair. Things like this. Or if you harm me in some way, then you should be harmed in the same way, and then that would be fair. That would be sort of that's a sense of just, maybe an immature sense, but sense of justice.
Yes,
And
yes.
Jesus teaches us something that's significantly different, and I think that's why it often disturbs us. Or,
Hmm.
perhaps you've heard the saying that it comforts the afflicted and afflicts the comforted, the
Hmm.
comfortable,
Hmm.
because this idea of grace has nothing to do with fair. And as
No.
you just indicated, right? It's like grace is this thing that's so much bigger and so much more loving, forgiving, gentle, all-consuming, and it's not fair. If I got for my life what was fair, sort of that eye for an eye teaching that Jesus takes and then says, "No, you've
Yeah.
heard that said, but let me tell you something better."
Yeah. And that was like, it was not only was it said, like that was the code by which in the ancient world, Hammurabi's code, in ancient Babylon, the standard by which cultural life existed. You take someone's eye, it is only fair for you to pluck yours out in return. And Jesus kind of flips that whole script on the head. If someone slaps you in a cheek, offer the other one. Um, and and I think I remember teaching this to my youth group kids, and they were like, "This is not fair." The story of, what was it, the landowner who you know, someone who didn't work the same amount of hours that everyone else in the field worked that day. Maybe they took one too many smoke breaks. Um, and he gets paid the same amount. How is that fair? The prodigal son. I highly relate to the older brother as an older sister. I actually, we don't know if he's the older brother. We just know he's the like goody two shoes brother, and I highly relate to that as the older sister kind of stereotype in my family of like, what do you mean he gets off scot-free? What do you mean that you're just gonna throw him a barbecue? No consequences for his actions? How is that fair? And Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount says the last shall be first and the first shall be last. And that certainly doesn't fit any fairness metric that the world would have. And I think it is this reflection of the kingdom of God that's so countercultural. And I said earlier, it's so annoying because I like I want things to work fairly. I want justice. I want those things, but Jesus totally flips the script. And what a better way to live, but it's an annoying way to live.
Yeah, no, I hear you. Well, and so I'm glad you brought up those two parables. We actually discussed those a couple weeks ago for some of
Oh,
the same reasons. And I'm not sure if I said this at that time or not, but when I was younger, my dad used to say, well, he would still say it to me now, but when I was younger, he used to say often, um, Katie, there's nothing you could do to make me love you any more or any less.
mm-hmm.
So unconditional love and grace, right? But Katie's little brain went, now wait a second. I can be the best kid ever and be honest every time and make straight A's and clean my room, and you're not going to love me anymore. I can't get any more. I want more, like
Yeah, yeah. What's the
human,
point?
how human we are in our
Mhm,
sense of that. And, or the other way being like, oh, well, then I can just be, this is not how little Katie's brain worked, but I can just be as awful as I want to be.
mhm.
And, you won't
What's the
love
point?
me any more, any less. And I think that's one of the hard but beautiful things that Jesus continues to call us to this sort of higher standard of living. And I think I used to think that was to make God happy.
Hmm.
And I think what I've realized in growing up with these is studying the parables and these teachings, they echo each other, is that
Hmm.
it's not to make God happy. It's because that's actually what's going to make me finally be happy in my human self made in the divine image.
Hmm.
Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount the storing up of treasure, right?
Hmm.
And the treasure in heaven versus the treasure on earth. And, I don't tend to think of heaven as like a place that I used to, as pearly gates and golden streets and these kind of
And
things.
harps and
In
little babies playing harps.
Yeah, that. And instead I've come to think of it more like these ideals of grace and peace and unconditional love and justice that are available to us in glimpses in this life that Jesus is always inviting us into in his teachings, but at some point become the fullness of our whole story. And so what I hear in Jesus talking about treasure is not like, oh, well, if you get your treasure on earth, that's it, and you're going to hell. Or
Hmm.
does he instead make a gracious invitation to us to invest in things that are not of financial and tangible means, but are
Hmm.
actually the matters of the heart?
Hmm. Hmm. That are, why does rich always have to mean wealthy? Perhaps can it mean whole instead? It it reminds me of, this is a silly example of my father-in-law is a mechanic and is salt of the earth kind of guy from rural Hartselle, Alabama. And the night before our wedding, when he was giving his little toast to our wedding party, he says, I don't have a lot of money, but tonight I'm the richest man in the world. And like it's one of those memories that will always like stick with me of like, oh my goodness, like wholeness and abundant life is so different than maybe the world's standards of it. And like it was just a moment that stuck out to me that came to mind now.
Yeah,
Uh,
I love that. And you often hear these pairings in Jesus's teachings that are often translated as prosperity, when
mhm,
we're doing the good things, and perish when
mhm,
we're giving into some of the world's temptations and these kind of things. But I've learned to kind of hold those, not unlike you were describing with your father-in-law, is that these prosperity things have so much more to do with these moments of joy, of these moments of connection with the divine, these moments of living into the fullness of what it can mean to be a child of God.
mhm,
And this parish meaning that when I am so focused on either, judging other people, when I am so focused on storing up treasure, when I am so focused
mhm.
on protecting, what's mine, um, that's when I start to degrade in a way
Yeah.
myself and my divine image.
And I was reading today in preparation for Easter, Lisa Sharon Harper's book. Oh, it's there we go. The Very Good Gospel, How Everything Wrong Can Be Made Right. And she had this incredible line about like the empty tomb and kind of like the comfort that there is in the tomb and what is dead in the tomb. I'm preaching this week on how it's in Luke's gospel about when the women approached the empty tomb and found these like shiny glowing men, and they said, why do you look for the living amongst the dead? And how the dead, according to Lisa Sharon Harper, sin is separation. That it is separation that is really the thing that's leaving us empty, and how those like things of prosperity are actually isolating ourselves more. I think about how like a huge goal of our family was to buy a house, and of course, what's the first thing you put up? A fence. And it's this separation from our neighbors, or in a way, like wealth separates us from a lot of I don't know, a lot of just living and a lot of being and separating from people who are different. And so that thought of like sin as separation from God and from others, I think that's a really powerful imagery and a way to think of things rather than like a list of things I've done wrong, but a list of like ways I've separated myself, and judgment is this separation. It is this separation that somehow I'm higher, I'm on another level, that I could look down on you. And thinking of the men and the story of the woman who's caught in adultery, and they were trying to trick Jesus to say like, well, the law says to stone her, and he writes something mysterious in the sand and then says, you without sin cast the first stone. You without some sort of separation in your life cast the first stone. And it was this way to break down, I think, the barriers of humanity a little bit.
I love that. And it brings again to mind this sort of different standard that we're called to. And I used to
Hmm.
think of it as a higher standard. But
Oh,
I
uh-huh.
think that has become complicated for me because I think it promotes that judgmental, self-righteous kind of positioning
Looking.
that you were just talking about
Hmm.
versus the sort of what Richard Rohr calls the downward mobility that the gospel always calls us to. It always is calling us to be
Hmm.
last, to be servant,
Hmm.
but also not in a painful way.
Hmm.
The Presbyterian Church, we say that the chief ends of humanity is to love God and enjoy God forever.
Hmm.
And that enjoy part, I think we also forget that. Like we're, either convinced that if we pray big enough, we're going to have everything we want to be happy,
Hmm.
or we have to sort of self-flagellate and sort of destroy ourselves and grind ourselves up in the process of trying to live out this very difficult path. And I think
Yeah.
what Jesus's actual teachings call us to something different. In fact, if Jesus were around today,
Oh.
here we go, here we go, gospel according to Katie. All right, paraphrase. I feel like he might just say, be different. Just be
Hmm.
different. And think about then that church, the teachings from the Sermon on the Mount where he talks about salt and light. You know, what good is salt
Hmm.
if it's lost its saltiness? What good? And it's like,
Hmm.
it's be different. Be different.
Yeah.
You don't have to play by the rules that have been laid out for you around
Hmm.
judgmentalism, around eye for an eye, around fair and right. There is something bigger and better for you.
Hmm.
And when you invest yourself into that goodness,
Hmm.
it yields a good life for you. And I
Hmm.
just feel like so often in Christianity, it becomes this sacrificial, self sacrificial kind of piece. But the sacrifice we're called to is sort of sacrificing our sin and the things that didn't serve us anyway, not
Yeah.
sacrificing our joy. And somehow I feel
Yeah.
like we got that mixed up.
Yeah. Yeah. It's that fine line between um, like we don't want to romanticize poverty or normalize poverty in a way that like we could find it really easy to excuse it, or normalize or romanticize suffering in the way that we're just like, well, that's just the way the world is. Like some people are poor and usually it's to my benefit. But at the same time that Jesus and God have this closeness, what Gustavo Gutierrez, the father of liberation theology, would call the preferential option for the poor. Um, so that like God in a way centers those who are in the last, the least, the last, and the lost is kind of the whole point. And so it's like finding that what you say, like it's not self-flagellation, but finding that line. Maybe that's the line in the sand that Jesus was writing in the story of the woman caught in adultery when he tells folks to throw the first stone if you're not in sin or if you've never sinned. So it's that fine line that I think is like one of our quests in our time of being human.
Okay, I have a question for you, and no right or wrong. This is not a test. But when you think about the 3 years of Jesus's ministry that we have the
Hmm.
most information about, um, and you think about what he was actually doing, like what it looked like, how he was spending his time, what are some of the things that come to mind for you, just initially?
Jesus liked to party. Um, I had a professor, Dr. Will Willimon, who he's written a ton of books, but a lot of his ministry was in college campus ministry. And he'd be like, it would be a whole lot easier for me to like be a chaplain in in colleges if Jesus didn't party so much. Um, but Jesus loved a dinner party. He loved a wedding. He loved to eat with people, and so I think so many of his a lot of his ministry is around dinner tables and is not just hosting, but in being hosted. He literally invited himself over to Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector's house, to like, hey, I'm gonna go over to your house. I'm gonna invite myself over. So when I kind of like the first thing I think about in Jesus's ministry is a table, and that's a sacred part of both the United Methodist and the Presbyterians liturgy is the communion table. We at Gathering Place we celebrate it every single week. That's not common in United Methodist churches, but I think that table for me is where a lot of his actions and teachings took place.
Mm, I love that. I love that you said that Jesus loves to party. I mean, I was sort of doing a little brainstorming myself. I'm like, let's see, he walked a lot, he took some naps.
He napped a lot too in inopportune times.
Right? He would go away to pray. He did that. He chatted with people. He had a number of conversations, healed some folks, and partying did not. I'm so glad that you brought that to the table because that was not on my list of things Jesus spent his time doing.
Yeah, I think we were doing yesterday in our church a reflective Palm Sunday prayer service, like a contemplative prayer service with meditations and then questions that we would ask. And one of them was, what do you think Jesus was like? And I wrote down that I think he was funny. I think he liked to laugh. I think he was like, from what I've read, like he seems to be pretty sarcastic and ironic a lot of the times. So So it makes sense to me that, like, when I imagine Jesus and from what I've interpreted, I think he was a funny guy who liked to eat and liked to party with his friends, and he had a very wide circle of friends too. And I think that wide circle of friends is we can't separate Jesus's crucifixion and resurrection from his life and actions, from his teachings and ministry, because I ultimately think that's what landed him on a cross. Um, so not just for the forgiveness of our sins, but like he seemed to make Rome really mad, and he also seemed to be the type of king, the type of teacher that was really unexpected, and maybe not quite what his followers wanted him to be, and that landed him on a cross too.
Yeah.
So his life and teaching, this being Holy Week, we cannot separate his death from what he said, who he ate with, and the message that he came, this liberation of the least, the last, and the lost is central to this week. So I think that I see that you're talking about crucifixion. Is it next week or in 2 weeks from now?
2 weeks.
But I like that his teachings and actions is part of Holy Week as well, because you can't have one without the other.
Yeah, I agree. And all of these teachings that seem to, I mean, you've already kind of pointed to, Jesus talks about the first will be the last.
Hmm.
Jesus teaches about, what seat you should take at the table, right?
Hmm.
Don't assume that you should be up at the top of the table at the right hand. Often the disciples seem to be sort of infighting about
Who's the
jockeying for
greatest?
position. Yeah,
Yeah.
this kind of thing. But all of Jesus's teachings are such an affront to the way
Hmm.
empire works.
Hmm.
Empire says amass wealth. Jesus says, nah, give it away.
Hmm.
Empire says we have to rank, we have to hierarchy, we have to institute, we have to have order. Jesus says, I think your orders are flawed. You
Hmm.
know, so when you
Yeah.
talk about how his teachings are what ended him up in crucifixion, which eventually gets us to this space of resurrection as well, it's because those teachings were such an affront, which to me, really, when I think about Jesus' actions, they all seem to be
Yeah.
building towards justice. And again, not that justice that we tend to think about as fair, but that unconditional love and grace kind of justice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, our discussion on the Sermon on the Mount, like I think the most memorable part is the Beatitudes, and Matthew and Luke have two different versions. And I'm looking at Matthew's right now, blessed are the poor in spirit, and in Luke it's literally just blessed are the poor, and it's this affront to what we understand as blessed. It is this flipping of what is powerful and what is strong and what is like worth seeking, like worth striving for. Blessed are the meek. I've never met anyone who's been like, I'm aspiring to be more meek. I've never heard like someone I mean I have heard maybe expectations of like what women should be, but I've yet to find someone who's like, I'm really that's the goal. Blessed are the hungry. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart. It's just flipping on its head, and it is an affront to power for sure.
And I'm struck by how differently I hear blessed used now.
Oh
You know
yeah.
what I mean? Like you see people walk around, it's like, I made all the green lights. Oh, I'm blessed. It's
Hmm.
like it's often associated with wealth, with amassing things. Like, oh,
Hmm.
look at my home. I know I'm blessed.
Hmm.
And that's such contrary to what you were just describing in Jesus's teachings in these Beatitudes. Blessed
Hmm.
isn't about the amassing of wealth. Blessed isn't about everything going your way.
Yeah.
So often he refers to blessed being about the opposite. And I did just want to mention, I am a part of a program with your blessed are the meek, and you don't know anybody who's seeking to be meek, and I don't either. It doesn't come natural to me, but I'm part of a program that invites a similar shift in thinking. So you've heard the saying, "Don't just sit there, do something."
Hmm.
And in this program, we often remind each other, "Don't just do something, sit there."
Mm,
And it's
hmm.
this invitation to be in the listening, to be in the praying, to be in the connection, to be in the pregnant pause, that our actions might be more reflective of our divine self and less reflective of the world's invitations to quick comebacks, gotchas, retributions, and revenge.
Yeah, that's very Holy Saturday. It's that holy pause, the pregnant pause of Holy Saturday of don't skip over it. Don't go right to the joy and the resurrection. Sitting in that liminal space a little bit too. I was sitting with someone in our congregation a few weeks ago who was at the time in hospice, who passed last Monday, and her funeral is going to be on Holy Saturday. And in that last final conversation we had, we talked about surrender and how surrender in our worldly standards would probably be synonymous with forfeiting or losing. And so much of Jesus's ministry and teachings, and ultimately his actions, what we see on the cross is the ultimate act of surrender. And how I think of like Paul's words of like his power was made perfect in weakness, and how surrender was sort of Jesus's secret weapon. And with this dear congregant who was talking about after a 10-year battle with cancer and choosing to end treatment, that surrender wasn't, reframing this like you didn't lose, you didn't forfeit, you didn't give up. That so much about the Christian life and Jesus's teaching is about surrendering. And that's actually quite a powerful and beautiful thing.
Mhm.
Um, and so it makes sense that her funeral is going to be on Holy Saturday, which is this liminal time. I find it to be a very sacred time. And if you've ever walked with someone at the end of their life, it's a beautiful sacred time as well. There's horror in it, but there's beauty too.
I can't
And
help but
so,
draw a connection between surrender and trust and faith.
mm-hmm,
The kind of trust and the kind of faith it takes. Because I mean, Jesus, as he makes this big sermon, which we can continue to talk about, but it occurs to me since we're entering into Holy Week, and then we have this Palm Sunday moment. There's
mm-hmm,
cloaks, there's palms, there's hosannas, but for him, this is a march toward death.
yeah,
This is a march towards an ending.
mm-hmm,
And I could imagine with Jesus being fully human and with
mm-hmm,
myself knowing what it feels like to be human, at least for a few years here, uh, I could imagine wanting to run from that. I could
yeah,
imagine wanting self-preservation. I could imagine wanting to make a lot of excuses about all the good I was doing with my life. I fed 5,000 people. Well, if there was more than one fee, I mean, I fed like 10,000 people one day, man. I was doing good work. Like I taught some good
impressive.
stuff. I had some good stories. I saved that one adulterous woman. I brought Lazarus back to life. You remember the little girl, the centurion's daughter? I did that too. I probably shouldn't die now. I'm at the top of my game,
Mm-hmm.
and just reminds me of the ways that we clutch and grasp at things that feel important to us. They feel powerful, um, and it doesn't mean that they're not.
Mm-hmm.
They can it can be both,
Yeah.
um, but that Jesus nonetheless knows what his next steps are, and it sounds like your parishioner at some point realized their next steps as well,
Mm-hmm.
and it was no longer the clutching, the grasping, the trying, the healing, the doing. There was time for that,
Mm-hmm.
but then this act of surrender feels like such a dramatic act of faith and trust that God's going to carry on the work
Yeah. Yeah. It was
in and through.
a total act of freedom. It was a pursuit of freedom for sure, which I mean, that's the gospel right there. This freedom that we experience from, I guess, the free, we're talking about the freedom from judgment, our ability to judge ourselves and judge others, this freedom from the pursuit of prosperity, and so much of Jesus's teaching lead to that that freedom and surrender, letting go and laying down is so much more a part of it. And I remember when I was just starting out seminary, we did like a Q&A session with some third year students at Duke Divinity School. And we were like, what's some advice you could give us first years of how to survive this? And she said so much of seminary, and I would say so much of the Christian life is more about laying down than putting more things on the to-do list. Um, and I've really kept that, and it has been an anchor for me, not just in being a leader in ministry, but in being a follower of Christ, that so much is about laying down and about surrendering.
Mhm. And so another section of this sermon, and throughout Jesus's life, actually, he does a lot of teachings on what the kingdom of heaven is like.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just so struck by the differences by how some of the metaphors and ways that Jesus describes the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God.
Mm-hmm.
And these conceptions, some of which we've already named around, pearly gates and, the little cherubs, little chubby cherubs with harps and, up in the clouds. It's always up. Heaven's always up.
Always up there.
And which evokes this sense of, which is actually a very capitalist kind of sense of like upward mobility. It's like
Distant.
we're headed up. But yeah, but when Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven, it's not about, heading up. It's not about accumulation. It's not about sort of gathering up a number of stars in our crown that we might have a place in
Mm-hmm.
this kingdom. And in fact, when Jesus teaches about, the lilies of the field and the
Mm-hmm.
birds of the air
Mm-hmm.
and how they don't worry, they don't worry
Mm-hmm.
about what they're going to have. They don't worry about where they're going to end up. They don't worry about where they're going to rest their head. Even the Son of Man, aka Jesus, doesn't worry about these things.
Yeah.
Um, and that's more of what the kingdom is about this idea of not worrying, not judging, not, I don't know. Or do any of those metaphors around the kingdom of heaven and what it's like?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I love like as a chronically stressed out, anxious type of person, like it used to kind of frustrate me that I think it's in Matthew 6, the story of like, do not worry, do not be anxious about anything. The birds don't, so why should you? Um, that like while it used to frustrate me, I'm like, well, I'm not a bird. I'm a human. And I have birds don't worry about money and birds don't worry about paying their rent and all of these things. And like kind of what has reframed that story for me was I heard Nadia Bolz-Weber speak a few years ago in Winter Park, and she preached on anxiety and she used this, and she's like, maybe Jesus was using the imagery of birds and flowers to like just like stop, smell the flowers, look at the birds, like be grounded, like ground yourself, touch grass. Is that's like a Gen Z slang right now. Like it sounds like you need to touch grass. It sounds like you need to ground yourself with the reality of what it is to be a creature on earth. I think that's such an affront to like we don't often consider ourselves creatures like we would consider birds or dogs or worms are creatures, but we're creatures too. So chill, like maybe Jesus was like, chill out. Look at the birds. Look at the smell the flowers for a moment, and that's incredibly liberating.
And if I find it interesting, one of the places that I hear a lot of those kinds of teachings um, taught is in various 12-step programs. Whether they're
Mm-hmm.
about, whatever we're addicted to. I mean, perhaps as pastors, we identify strongly with the idea of being addicted to people and perceptions. We often fall
Mm-hmm.
into codependency kinds of habits. And these kinds of things. So this idea of not worrying, not having anxiety that you've brought up, this idea of having less, um, you know,
Hmm.
sometimes sort of capitalizes this minimalism. We're not good at it, but that one. And it seems like that's a lot of what Jesus kind of invites us into or to consider. And in 12 step programs, they talk about like getting your headspace right so that, if I'm not spending my time judging other people or comparing myself to other people, if I'm not spending my time frantically making to-do lists and that are far more than I can ever accomplish, and then, ending up in a cycle of checking some things off and adding things to where the list never gets done.
Hmm.
If I am taking some time to touch some grass, I love that. I had not heard that. Thank you. Um,
Ask your kids about touching grass.
I will ask my teenagers about touching grass, and I will get an eye roll. And Mom, please don't say that. You're not allowed. If history proves. But the idea is that, by shedding some of these things that are not super useful and that continue to facilitate our anxiety, our frustration, and our false sense of control, we
Hmm.
make space for there to be a higher power in control, is the way, Al-Anon and codependency teachings kind of talk about it. There's
Hmm.
now space for the trust and the faith in these things that Jesus is telling us to cultivate, right?
Hmm.
So it's not that we have to relentlessly add, and I think sometimes that's the way we hear these things, like, oh, great, there's another thing I have to do,
Hmm.
you know. But instead, it's this invitation to release some of these things so that there is a space for the divine to do her work
Yeah. Yeah.
within us, and in fact invites us to be more like the divine instead of sort of this chiseling at ourselves by doing enough righteous deeds
Hmm.
and measuring ourselves against
Hmm.
others,
Yeah.
and there are none of the kingdom of heaven is like that invites us to that kind of self sort of spiritual mutilation, if you will.
Ooh, yeah. Speaking of Kingdom of Heaven, what do you think about the mustard seed metaphor? How do you understand that? I've heard a lot of different takes on like, okay, what does the mustard seed? One time I was preaching at a campus ministry and I like handed out mustard seeds and then this girl was like, I'm like coincidentally allergic to mustard seeds. So I had to like take back all these like they're so tiny, they're itty bitty. Um, but that like Jesus describes the kingdom of God like a mustard seed.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thank you for saying that because I was going to ask for a little paraphrase there, which I'm known to give a very broad stroke Katie paraphrase of some of these ideas, but that faith even the size of a mustard seed, which again, our non-agrarian culture, we may not even know. So I'm appreciating that you had noted how
They're
small it is.
at least the ones that they sell in Publix are really tiny.
And to me, I think that the invitation, I mean, what I've often thought of is that that's a place to start.
Hmm.
Right? Like that is a place where the unfolding can begin to happen. Because when I think about Jesus's ministry and how he lived his life, it was like there wasn't enough loaves and fishes to feed everybody, but he blessed it and broke it, and there was.
Hmm.
Jesus only had 3 years. That's not enough years to change the world. That's not enough. But his body was broken for us, and that
Hmm.
it was. And so when I think about the mustard seed, when I think about all the not enough ism, if I may,
Hmm.
um, and I think about this tiny little thing. He says, no, no, no. Even that is enough, not because it's enough all on its own, but because it is something that unfolds and grows and becomes more through
Hmm.
some of that grace stuff we talked about, through some of that love stuff we talked about, through some of that a power greater than ourselves, to borrow language from 12 step programs, that makes it enough.
Yeah.
And it makes me think of myself. I am not enough on my own to do all the things and be all the things I want to be. Well,
Hmm.
I'm not. I can't. It's impossible. The things that I feel called to and the dreams that I have are too big for Katie alone.
Hmm.
But it doesn't have to be Katie alone.
Hmm.
And I think that's for me what mustard seed invites me into a train of thought instead of it being sort of a dead end of here's this little thing, make sense of it. It's like, oh, it's a little thing that becomes another thing.
Hmm.
How do you start to think about
Well,
that? Oh, do you
the
want to
mustard
chime in here?
the mustard seed, I was just looking up. Every time you talk about something, I'm looking it up. The mustard seed, very minute seed, and it can grow to a shrub of 6 to 12 feet, height of 6 to 12 feet.
Mm-hmm.
So it's saying how a little tiny thing can grow into something so big.
Mm. And what
You
does
know, if
it
your
say,
faith
like
is very small, that it will expound. Or,
that the
if you
the
start off, go
yeah,
ahead.
the faith that the size of a mustard seed is it can move mountains, that like even that shrub can change the rock formations, it can change the landscape, it could impact the whole ecosystem around it as well. Where like, I don't know, can this little seed truly push a mountain? But maybe it's the seed that was planted that can change the environment around it.
Yeah, you know what that brings up because we don't
Mhm.
really have a lot of mustard bushes around here, but what we do have is sea oats, which is a similar idea. The sea oats, not they're small, they're kind of weak, but they will hold the land together
Mm-hmm.
because of their root systems and those kind of things. They prevent erosion. You're always as a person born near the beach, and you're to asked not to walk over the sea oats in the sand because they're what hold it all together. So as you were describing, sort of how a mustard seed and a mustard plant can become part of a landscape that makes it stronger, even though it seems like such a small thing.
Mm-hmm.
It can be part of what holds the whole thing together.
Mm-hmm.
And I just can't, I can't help but hear the invitation to consider ourselves, the individual humans, such a such a small thing, a life, one life, such a small thing.
Mm-hmm.
Small, and if you think about how many, this a world that's been in existence for billions of years,
Mm-hmm.
and we each get a lifespan of, max 100, let's say, ish, but so it's not that long.
Mm-hmm.
It is but a little seedling in
Mm-hmm.
the midst of the grandness of time, the greatness of time, the expanse of the world, and yet,
Mm-hmm.
like, let us not waste it. It can become part of this landscape that holds the whole thing together. It can become so much bigger and more than it first
Yeah.
appears with a little bit of faith, you know?
Mm. And the story of the mustard seed contextually is in a larger story about was Jesus, I think he was like scolding the disciples for not healing folks. Like he's like, I told you to go out and heal people. Like I said that you could. Don't you know that faith the size of a mustard seed can move mountains? And that to me is liberating because it means that like it gives us permission to doubt and still a huge impact, even with our shaky faith. And even with a faith that seems really small, like I find, in both your context, your church context, First Pres and Missing Peace, I feel like makes space for folks who have deconstructed and are trying to reconstruct their faith and maybe who identify as a bit of spiritual misfits. And so in the gathering place is similar. Is a we say that we're a safe haven for people with big questions. Um, and it almost gives permission of like, yeah, even a mustard, even if your faith is not the size of a boulder, maybe your faith is the size of a mustard seed and you have a lot of doubts and a lot of questions, and you think that church people are not to be trusted and pastors can be sketchy, and you don't like religious institutions, and you've got a lot of questions, but still that can still move mountains. That the faith the size of a mustard seed with all of your doubts and all of your insecurities and qualms about institutional religion, which I think Jesus would have some qualms with too. Um, like that's still enough. It's enough. So come.
And even blessed, and even blessed. I mean, if we go
Yeah.
back to those beatitudes, that even that is
Hmm.
blessed. And I'm sure you've experienced this, Amy, probably you, Gary, and Rick and Holly too. But sometimes I meet folk who are not church folk, who don't identify as church folk, but by looking at their life are so clearly good folk.
Hmm.
And then I have met church folk who proclaim loudly to be church folk, and at looking at their lives, at the fruit of their existence,
Hmm.
don't appear to have invested in the world and in goodness in the same way.
Hmm.
And so as
Yeah.
you think about this mustard seed and you think about just this little thing, or we think about this blessed are the poor and the weak, or the poor in spirit, even,
Hmm.
it just evokes for me that it's like that's yet another reason that sort of qualifies and supports
Hmm.
Jesus' invitation not to judge.
Hmm.
Because it's even this little bit. And it's sort of like God's up to something. I just feel
Hmm.
like that's what Jesus is always telling us in his teachings and his movements. Like, God's up to something.
And theirs is the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
Theirs, theirs is, where does it say that? For they will inherit the earth. Theirs is the kingdom.
Mm,
Blessed are the persecuted.
yeah. And all of these people that we tend to sort of dismiss societally or
Hmm.
push to the margins and the edges. I know here in Daytona Beach, one of the what I see as one of the great sins of this city is that whenever a big event comes into town, races, you know, they scoop up all of the impoverished folks and homeless folks and street dwelling folks and anybody who just doesn't look real pleasant, and they sort of shovel them off to various jails, shelters, and cheap motel rooms
Hmm.
for a few days in order to promote an identity as, you know, clean and
Hmm.
safe and
Hmm.
whatever else they're trying to identify by sweeping off these people into the margins. And it's sort of like Jesus, man, just
Hide.
they, those are
Sounds
the
like they're
folks.
trying to hide them.
Yeah,
Hmm.
seems like Jesus is saying, wait, you're missing it.
Hmm.
Those are the folks. Those are the folks who
Yeah.
did it.
And while the shelter that was built here is a tremendous win, it's still in the outskirts of the city limits. It really like puts a literal reminder of the word outsider, outcast,
Mhm.
people on the margins, that they are sent off to the quite literally the margins of our city.
Yeah. And I know you have to go soon, Amy, but I don't want to go without talking about Jesus's pace,
Mm.
the pace that he moved through his
Hmm.
life. I mean, not just because, in part because um, life in those days would have meant a lot of walking, moving at the
Hmm.
pace of walking.
Hmm.
So we're not talking three sort of modern day American years here where you could see the whole world, you know, or bits and pieces of it anyway. We're talking about 3 years on foot. And there's several places in the scripture where people say, Jesus, Jesus, come take care of this, come do that. People are have a sense of urgency because of what is going on in their lives. And Jesus seems to sort of say, there will be enough time. I'm going to go take care of this. Even Lazarus's death, right, happens when Jesus is
Hmm.
on a different kind of mission, and Jesus, come quick, and he's like,
Yeah,
get
and
some
then
other
the
stuff to do.
sisters are mad because, like, if you had just gotten here on time, if you just picked up the pace a little bit, our brother would still be alive.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what was it that Jesus's like travels only took him? I don't know where I heard this, so please fact check me, Gary Rogers. That Jesus's ministry was only like a span of a couple hundred miles, maybe 100 miles, if that. So it's not like, the impact that he had. He wasn't traveling all around the world. Like his ministry, and he most of that time was just hanging out with 12 12 dudes, and also I believe, Mary Magdalene and the women who just don't get mentioned as much. But with like a very small group of people is where he did probably 90% of his ministry. Not everything that he did was like packed out, sold out crowds. Like there's a few instances of that, but I would say a lot of his teachings are just to a small group of people.
Yeah. It's just such a lovely invitation out of the urgency of our world these days to me. It's
Hmm.
such an invitation to take that little mustard seed and plant it. Don't throw it out. I know it doesn't seem like much, but let's
Hmm.
plant it. You know, let's do something with it, and let's pay attention to these folks that Jesus called blessed, that the rest of us push to the margins.
Hmm.
And let's re-envision what it means to live in kingdom living,
Hmm. Yeah.
in
Yeah, and that
contrast to capitalist living and empire living.
sure. And that you don't need a packed out, sold out arena to do good ministry work when the majority of Jesus's ministry was investing in a small group of people who would then invest in a small group of people, who would then invest in a small group of people. Was Jesus like the starter of the, what was it? The
Multi-level marketing?
multi-level marketing scheme?
I think so. I'll think so, but I see where you're going with it.
In a better way. Maybe we should end here. Things are going off the off the rails here.
Well, I mean, going back to Lazarus, I was watching a medical, I don't remember what it was, a show on TV, police show or doctor show, something like that. And there's a condition called the Lazarus effect,
Mm.
where a person, I mean, they've named this after Lazarus, where a person can have like a cardiac arrest and be basically declared dead, but his heart rate has gone so slow. I guess that's what it means, that they can't detect the heart rate or detect the person is actually alive. Then all of a sudden, person wakes up
Pops back up.
and yeah, comes back up alive, and they call that the Lazarus effect in
Wow.
a medical term. I didn't know that till I was watching your show. I just looked it up, like,
There you go.
but so they're kind of saying that, well, Jesus really didn't bring him back from the dead. He was actually still kind of,
In that man's land.
and yeah, kind of like he was just, they couldn't tell he was still alive because his heart rate was so slow or whatever it might be. So
Well,
they're
I
kind of
know,
giving that excuse.
yeah, Carrie, I know our friend Amy here has to go. So, Amy, thank you
I
so
know
much.
I got to go too.
No,
So
oh, well, you can or not. I'm going to close this out a little bit, but I just wanted to give you an exit and thank you, Amy, for coming on tonight and sharing some of your wisdom with us.
Absolutely. I'm grateful to learn about the Lazarus effect and
well, look it
good to
up. Just
know
look
if
it
I'm
up.
ever in that situation, like give me a few minutes to wake up.
Well, I mean, look it up and see. I mean, see what it.
Come back and see us anytime, Amy. We love you.
Yeah. All
Bye.
right. Bye.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Rick and Holly, I see your screen came on. Did you have something come to mind?
I just don't. Well, just appreciate all that you folks do and share and all the insights that you have. It's always wonderful.
Mm.
I've got 1 3/4 pages of notes.
Oh, wonderful.
So so obviously I've been stimulated, and so I really do appreciate it. Questions that we can pursue at another time, but one of them is when Jesus calls us to a different standard than the world standard. Yeah, that's fine, except that we live in the world, and so the challenge there is can be sizable.
Yeah, and I think Jesus acknowledges that, which can be a little bit scary for us, but is also, I think, just a lovely way of Jesus saying, I know what I'm asking you to do is difficult. He talks about, it's easier to go through a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is well, in one case, he says for a rich man to follow these, teachings, or another place that talks about the narrow way versus the wide way, or talks about the sheeps and the goats. And sometimes those metaphors and ideas are used as a way to say, certain people are going to hell and certain people are going to heaven. But I don't believe that. Number one, I don't believe that God would let any of God's children go to hell. I just think God would relentlessly pursue, as I would relentlessly pursue my children. And God's got to be a little better than me, I figure. But I also think it's just an acknowledgement of like how much. It's an acknowledgement of how hard it is. How much better does it feel to you when someone says, "Boy, that's hard. That's hard."
Mhm.
What you're trying to do, what you're wanting to do, who you're wanting to be, that's hard. Than it is to just sort of placate and whitewash and sort of make these broad generalizations of, oh, sure, this is what you're supposed to do. Now suck it up and do it.
Mhm.
And I was just so grateful. One of the things that I think I'm going to take from this that really has stuck to my heart today is Amy inviting us to consider that Jesus again and again seems to say, you don't need a lot. A mustard seed, a few people. As I think about our church that we're building and growing and becoming together, it's like sometimes there's just a few of us. Can we divorce ourselves from the not enough-ism that is so contagious in our imperial society and instead invite ourselves into Jesus's version that's like, you don't have to worry about that. I'm the one who grows the seed. You know, Jesus is the one who makes it enough. The bread and the fish, it's not enough. Jesus makes it enough. God makes it enough. Mustard seed, that's not enough. God makes it enough. 12 disciples, far too few. God makes it enough. And you don't need a lot. And I'm so grateful for that because sometimes I don't feel like I got a lot. But I got y'all, and I'm so glad that you came to another episode of Jesus 101, this one on teachings and actions of Jesus. Next week, in a sort of timely way, we'll be talking about, actually, it's going to be 2 weeks, so you'll have a little breather in between, some chance to absorb Easter. But then we'll be talking about crucifixion and resurrection. And then we're going to talk about the Trinity, and that'll kind of round out our Jesus 101. So good to see you guys. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Amy.
All righty.
Katie, what am I saying? And Amy.
And Amy, we love you, Amy. We're sure you'll watch later.
Yeah. Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Okay.
Right, bye.
Bye.